None of us want to think that we are controlled by fear. But if you think about it, how often do you avoid doing things that you'd actually be really interested in doing because you're afraid of what other people think, or you're afraid you're going to fail? Or maybe you find yourself fixated on something that you just can't stop thinking about because you're like, well, what if this happens, or what if that happens? So we've been in this series called Vibes, and today we're talking about fear. Feeling afraid is totally unavoidable, but it's how we respond to that fear that matters. We can't just make a choice not to feel fearful. As human beings, we have lots of thoughts about what might happen in the future. Those thoughts typically take one of two forms: fear or hope. And so you might feel fearful when your brain gathers all this information and then starts to wonder, well, what if this happens, or what if that happens, and I can't control this, and so this thing could happen and that might be bad. And so often we think the way to avoid feeling fearful is to avoid thinking about the future. And so while we often try that of like, I'm just going to block it out, I'm just not even going to think about that, that doesn't actually work. And thinking about the future is actually one of the ways that we've been able to accumulate knowledge and then build on that knowledge and then develop and grow and change as a human species. And it's that same ability that allows us to feel fear that helps us to imagine and have hope and to dream for the future. These are all really great things that we think about that are future oriented. These are the things that give us hope. And this imagining, this dreaming, this inventing, that's the same ability that gets our minds swirling in what ifs about the future. So when we think about the future, we've got these two paths of thinking about either hope or fear. And when we're feeling fearful, our world tends to shrink into like a laser focus of whatever we feel fearful about. We tend to forget about all the wonderful, hopeful, beautiful, good things that could happen in the future. And we just start to get laser focused on all the terrible things that could happen in our world, or that test that we're totally not prepared for that we're probably going to fail. Or we get super worried about, like, I like this person, but what if they don't like me back? And what if I embarrass myself and let them know that I like them, and then I'm going to be crushed, and no one's ever going to like me if they don't like me back. And we start getting all the way down this tunnel vision of fear, and we forget that there's all this possibility and this hope for the future. But that's what fear does, is it gives us tunnel vision. And so if you're like me, once you start to get in that fearful train of thought, it is pretty all-consuming. You start to get in that, what if this, what if that? But there is good news about fear. Jesus talks to us about fear a lot. He has a lot to say about fear. The problem is we tend to read some of the verses where Jesus speaks about fear, we tend to read them totally out of context. And when we do that, they end up sounding like they're just not possible or practical. For example, Jesus did say, "Fear not." And so we read that and we read it out of context, and we tend to think, "Fear not." Yeah, that's even possible. Like, you're just telling me, like, oh, just don't even have that emotion. And so when it doesn't work for us, we tend to discredit what Jesus is saying. So what I want us to do today is to pay more attention to what Jesus says in context. And so we're going to jump around a little bit, but I actually think this will be really helpful. And so I want us to start with something that Jesus says to his 12 disciples at one point. This is in Matthew chapter 10, verse 16. He says, "I am going to send you out like sheep among wolves." Now, if you're one of the disciples and you're hearing that, that's not very comforting, because, wolves are predators and sheep are prey. And so Jesus is saying, like, you guys are like prey, and I'm going to send you out amongst predators, like the ones you literally just want to get away from. And then Jesus gets more specific. He tells them, you are going to be arrested and beaten. And then to wrap it all up, he says, don't be afraid. And so when we hear that, we're like, oh my gosh, like, does he even know what he's saying? So we tend to read that and we tend to stop there. But it's important that we look at the context in which he says this. It's part of a bigger story. Jesus had an experience with the 12 disciples just before this conversation where he says, I'm going to send you out like sheep among wolves. And so we're going to look at that first because that helps to shape the context of what he's telling us about fear. And so in this story, preceding his comment about sending you out like sheep among wolves, Jesus and the disciples are in a boat in the Sea of Galilee. And while they're there, this incredible storm starts to happen. And this is recorded by Matthew, one of Jesus' disciples, in Matthew chapter 8, verse 24. It says, suddenly a furious storm came up on the lake, and the waves swept over the boat. And so Jesus and his disciples are in this boat in the middle of the water, and they're in this crazy storm. And you can imagine the waves and the wind and the thunder, and they're in this boat probably thinking like, this is it. Like, we're going to die. Like, the boat's going to flip over and we're all going to drown in the middle of the lake. And so what is Jesus doing when this is happening? He's asleep. Can you imagine what his disciples must have been thinking when they realized that Jesus was asleep? They were probably thinking something that we often think. I knew it. You don't even care. And so naturally, they wake him up. And so this is in Matthew chapter 8, verse 25. It says, they say to him, Lord, we are going to drown. Save us. The disciples are frustrated and they are scared. And they're telling Jesus after they wake him up, like, do something. You're just asleep. And so I want you to look at how Jesus responds in Matthew chapter 8, verse 26. He says, you of little faith. Why are you so afraid? And I can only imagine the disciples' response of like, why am I afraid? Hello, we're in the storm in the middle of a sea. Like, I know you've been asleep, but the rest of us are worried about this boat flipping over and us drowning in the middle of the sea. Hello, that's what I'm afraid of. But Jesus has a different perspective. He's not overly consumed by the storm. He's teaching them a lesson. He's teaching them about fear. So I want you to pay attention to what he does next. He gets up. He doesn't panic. And that's important because what we see about Jesus in the midst of fear and chaos is he stays calm. And then Matthew says Jesus spoke to the wind and the waves and they calmed down. And the disciples are amazed. And this is what they say in Matthew chapter 8, verse 27. They say, what kind of man is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him. And when they thought about what they just saw, they knew, like, this is unbelievable. The wind and the waves listen to him, like he is in control of nature. Who is this that can control nature? I mean, he has ultimate power if he can control nature. He has such power, but he's using that power to care for his friends, and that's important. In this moment, their confidence in Jesus becomes more powerful than their fear of the storm. And that's the lesson for us. It's at this point that Jesus is teaching them to show them that their feelings of fear don't have to control them. That's what he's teaching us. Your feelings of fear don't have to control you. Show them there is someone, God, that is bigger and more capable than whatever you are afraid of. And so I want us to go back to that conversation where Jesus says he's going to send them out like sheep among wolves. Jesus follows that up by saying, do not be afraid of those who kill the body, but who cannot kill your soul. In other words, if you're going to be afraid of something, make sure you're afraid of the right thing. A storm? That's not nearly as big as God. And those dangerous situations that you might find yourself in, like sheep among wolves, don't be afraid because they're not as big as God. Know God's power and know God's love for you. And he's saying, hey, remember we were in that boat in the storm and you were afraid? You were afraid of the wrong thing. Did you have the right to be afraid? Sure. Human beings are going to feel afraid. But didn't you know you were with someone that was more powerful than that storm? And Jesus goes on, this is actually in the next verse, Matthew chapter 10, verses 29 through 31. He says, are not 2 sparrows sold for a penny, yet not one of them will fall to the ground outside of your Father's care. And even the very hairs on your head are numbered. So don't be afraid. You are worth more than many sparrows. Jesus is saying, God is paying attention to you. He knows more about you than you do. You don't know the number of hairs on your head, but He does. And that's how closely He's paying attention. Don't be afraid. You are worth far more than the sparrows. If God's paying attention to them, do you not think He's paying attention to you? Don't be afraid. He's reminding us you are valuable to God, and He is close to you, and He knows your circumstances. He knows what you're afraid of. He is concerned with the things that concern you, with your very real life, with your fear about the test and your fear about the way the world is going and your fear about whether or not that person likes you back. He cares about what you care about, and He knows what you're afraid of, but He's bigger than that. When it comes to dealing with fear, we want to keep in mind that God knows all about what we're afraid of and that He's in it with us, just like He was in the boat with the disciples when they were afraid. And so I want to fast forward a little bit. I want to fast forward when these same disciples go on to see Jesus arrested and led to the cross. And what happens to the disciples when Jesus is arrested is that they abandon Him. Why do they abandon Him? Because they're afraid. They don't want to be arrested. They don't want to be taken to the cross. And they basically deny knowing Him and just hide from like, oh yeah, we were not with that guy. But a few days later, a resurrected Jesus appears to them. And they realize He's alive. And that's a game changer because the guy they had been following died and come back to life. And that makes everything He had taught more real, more true, more believable. Suddenly, all the times He said, don't be afraid, make more sense. Because the thing that we are chiefly afraid of is death. Many of the things we say we're afraid of, heights, snakes, being on an airplane, all of those things really just come back to our fear of death. And what they see in the resurrected Jesus is, oh, He's conquered that. The thing I am most afraid of, Jesus has conquered that. So He can handle whatever we are afraid of. So for these disciples who loved and followed Jesus, the resurrection was everything. It made them bold. It gave them strength and confidence that they said, you know what, I might feel afraid, but I'm going to trust that God is bigger than that. And that not only is He bigger than that, but He is paying attention to my life and that He cares. And that's the lesson for us. Because what we know is that the things we are most afraid of, we can trust that God knows about them and that He's with us and that He cares. And so that's my hope for you. I want to wrap up by quoting something that Peter, one of Jesus' disciples, says. And it's worth knowing about Peter because Peter's with Jesus this whole time. And over and over and over, Peter promises things that he doesn't deliver on. But the main reason he doesn't deliver on them is because he's afraid. And so after being with Jesus and living life with Him and then watching Jesus be arrested and then crucified and then resurrected, Peter writes this. And I think it's really important because it teaches us a lot. This is in 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 7. He says, cast all your anxiety on Him because He cares for you. I'm going to say that one more time. Cast all your anxiety on Him because He cares for you. So my friends, my hope for you is that that's what you take from this, right? That's what you remember, is that are you going to feel afraid? Yes, absolutely. That's part of being a person. But you take all of those things that you are afraid of and you give them to God and you trust that He is bigger than those things, that He is paying attention and that He loves you. Love you guys.